Let's talk about the Chicago experiment, the brief moment where the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints covered the cost for their best religion instructors to go get an education at one of the hubs of America's modernist scholarship. Today, when people think about LDS religious education, they often think of censorship and the restrictions and cultural retrenchment and an unwillingness to engage modern scholarship and ideas. But that hasn't always been the case. Indeed, there was a moment during the 1920s and 1930s when it seemed that the LDS tradition, especially through its flagship university, BYU, was much more willing to take a modernist trajectory. Let's talk about this fascinating and often forgotten story, what many scholars have called the Chicago experiment, and why it still matters when considering the LDS Church today. Though Brigham Young University can trace its roots back to the 1870s, it didn't really become a university until the 1920s, and that was largely due to one man, Franklin Harris, who was appointed the new president of the university during the early 1920s. He was the first monogamist to be the president of the university, but he was also the first president to have advanced degrees from higher education institutions across the nation. And he wanted to transform what was the Brigham Young Academy into a nation-leading university. And he took a number of steps to reform what had been primarily a teaching preparatory school and transform it into a modern university. He helped it gain accreditation, which was a huge step for the institution. He hired professors with PhDs. He sent professors out to get advanced education from other world-leading universities. And he granted faculty a degree of academic liberty and freedom that they had previously not really been allowed. This was only about a decade removed from a blow-up over evolution around 1911, maybe a topic for a future video. But the reason why Franklin Harris was able to have some success in reforming BYU was this was during an era where the church in general, and BYU in particular, was ripe for change. Post-polygamy Mormonism, as the faith was trying to assimilate into American culture, could have taken a number of potential trajectories. That assimilation, to a degree, seemed to imply a form of modernization, or at least professionalization. And the LDS president during the 1920s, Heber J. Grant, was much less dogmatic than his immediate predecessor, Joseph F. Smith, who always was skeptical of modernist scholars. There are also a number of apostles at the time, like James Talmage and John Widtsoe, who were willing to, if not embrace, at least engage modern scholarship on science and humanities and history. And the church had appointed a series of new commissioners of education, the men in charge of the church's education pursuits, men like Adam Benyon and Joseph Merrill, who also had advanced degrees and therefore wanted to help transform the church's educational system to match the wider world. Heber J. Grant, as president, took a much more hands-off approach to BYU and these learning institutions, saying, I don't have the training myself, so I'm going to trust you to do what you feel is best. And so BYU appeared on the road to modernization during the 1920s and early 1930s. And in that modernization was a new approach to religion in particular. Religion became one of the most popular majors on campus, and the religion department was very different than what you might consider today. Most of the courses were things like evolution and religion, or comparative religion, or philosophy and religion. In fact, of the 41 courses on religion taught in the 1920s, only about 20 focused on the LDS Church. That shows how much broader they were in approaching it. And further, the Adam Benyon and Joseph Merrill, who were trying to reform church education, they tried to set up a series of what come to be known as institutes, these hubs of LDS scholarship at different universities, especially across the Mountain West, in which Latter-day Saints could engage not just Latter-day Saint teachings, but the broader scholarly world. They had a very progressive view of what Mormonism could be and offer in the new era. By the way, if you enjoy these kind of nerdy deep dives into historical topics, and if you're watching this video, that probably means that's you. I hope you are subscribed to this channel, and if you enjoyed the video, please share it with others and like it. Every Monday I try to do deep dives, Wednesdays I connect the past with the present, and on Fridays I peel back the layers of the historical field to talk about how you too can become an expert in history. All right, let's get back to today's topic. So now that they were modernizing Brigham Young University and creating these new institutes across the nation, they wanted to be able to staff those institutions with religious instructors who were willing to bridge these worlds of LDS and the academy. And so they envisioned a daring scheme in which they were going to pay the tuition and the living costs for some of their best and brightest school students to go to none other than the University of Chicago, which was known as the hub of modernist scholarship. And I want to take a step back and talk about that term, modernist, because it meant a certain thing during these 1920s and 1930s. American Christians were embroiled in what comes to be known as the modernist versus fundamentalist debate. The modernists are those who are much more willing to engage and incorporate modern scholarship and revisit old traditional ideas and beliefs and values. And the fundamentalists were those who were saying that America was losing her way, that we need to return to those fundamental ideas like scriptural literacy and ecclesiastical authority. Note, for instance, a couple of political cartoons, these partisan images from the fundamentalists denouncing these modernist scholarship. Here, for instance, is an image titled Descent of the Modernists, which shows that if you are learning these things like evolution and higher criticism of scripture is going to eventually lead the people down the steps toward atheism. Or here is another anti-modernist political cartoon, the Pied Piper, that shows that the professor who is trying to teach you evolution is eventually going to lead you into the dark caves of atheism. So with that broader context in mind, it should be notable that the LDS Church authorities are sending their scholars to the University of Chicago, where most of that fundamentalist scholarship is coming from. There was an idea that Latter-day Saints should not be afraid of the lessons that came from those disputes. And as a further way to expand this discussion and evolution, the Commissioner of Education created these Aspen Grove meetings every summer. Aspen Grove was a BYU campground nestled in the back of Mount Timpanogos, and where LDS religious educators would gather every summer and learn how to become better teachers, but also incorporate the new teachings of the academy. And so they not only heard from apostles like James Talmage and John Widtsoe, but also those scholars that are being sent to Chicago and coming back. And even more, eventually, they start hearing directly from those Chicago educators who they would bring out to Utah and teach these religious professors who are going to be staffed in the BYU religion department or at the institutes. Here is one of my favorite images from this time, John Widtsoe on the bottom left, sitting with a number of these teachers at one of these Aspen Groves meetings. It would be hard to overstate the results of this era of experimentation, of academic freedom granted these professors, the training coming from Chicago, now being filtered out throughout church education. There were now students' parents who were complaining to BYU officials that their kids were learning that evolution was true, which can't be the case. And perhaps one of my favorite points of evidence of how the society was in this modernization scheme was a survey that was done on BYU campus in 1935 by a BYU student by the name of Harold Christensen. He surveyed nearly 75% of the BYU student body, asking them questions about doctrine, theology, practice, and society. And the results are quite shocking, especially if you come to think about BYU and Mormonism as much more fundamentalist space. For instance, 62% of BYU students did not believe there was a literal devil. 64% of BYU students believed that humanity's creation involved evolution in some form. 89% were okay with some form of birth control, and only about half attended church every week, paid tithing, kept the word of wisdom, or engaged in daily prayers. In other words, this was a student body that was more akin to the modernist settings across America, detached from the pioneer principles. Now, when Franklin Harris learned the results of the survey, he halted all publication plans. He knew the backlash it would prompt. But it was too late because there were already enough complaints from students, but especially from LDS authorities who weren't of the modernist persuasion, that prompted the church to start cutting back on those freedoms and this progress and this modernist reform. Because you see, during the 1930s, a number of church leaders, most notably Heber J. Grant, the president, started listening to these anti-modernist intellectual currents that were worried that America was losing their foundations, listening to the fundamentalist arguments. Here is a cartoon from this era that shows this fear that the octopus of secularism was infringing upon all our public spaces, including schools. And that same fear started spreading in the LDS community, that BYU was becoming much too secular, much too unmoored from her origins to teach Mormon doctrines. And among those who were really concerned was J. Reuben Clark, who, if you've watched several of my videos or you've read my book, know plays a crucial role in Mormonism's retrenchment in the 20th century. Clark denounced what he called the literati of Mormons who were preaching and incorporating ancient paganism and modern day atheism, and he convinced Heber J. Grant that this was a threat on their own school's campus. Leaders were especially alarmed when one of these Chicago-trained scholars gave a public address that said that the Bible has to be interpreted according to external evidence, i.e. secular investigation, rather than mere tradition or gasp revelation. So Heber J. Grant, as a result, reversed his position of benign neglect and now wanted to assure that BYU professors were teaching what he called the fundamentals. Note that key word and its overlap with the broader cultural current. And the big moment, the death knell of the Chicago experiment and the modernist reforms at BYU came in the summer of 1938 at one of those Aspen Grove gatherings, which previously had symbolized the incorporation of Mormon thought into the broader academic academy. But now J. Reuben Clark addressed that gathering in 1938 and delivered an address titled The Charted Course that in many ways has framed LDS religious instruction ever since. In that address, he denounced what he called the newest fangled ideas of the academy. He said that professors, and especially religion professors, need to focus on the fundamentals, which he defined as scriptural literalism and the divine mission of Joseph Smith. And that address soon became an official First Presidency statement. It was published in the church's newspapers, and it framed how the church is supposed to approach education in general and religious education in particular. That address was the nail in the coffin of the Chicago experiment. Many of those Chicago-trained scholars eventually moved elsewhere. Some even left the church. Franklin Harris, who had envisioned and tried to push forward these reforms, eventually left BYU to become president at Utah State University. And then several decades later, in the 1970s, some scholars performed the same survey that had been done at BYU in 1935. Remember the survey I talked about, these modernist answers to questions. That same survey was offered again in 1973. And whereas the answers were much more modernist in 35, now they were much more fundamentalist in 1973, showing a full and successful fundamentalist shift within BYU culture. If you or your children were to attend BYU now, one of the classes that all incoming freshmen are required to take is a new class titled Becoming BYU, a way to teach students not just how to be students, but to acquaint them with the legacies and fundamentals of the BYU tradition. And what's one of the first texts they will read in that class? J. Reuben Clark's Charted Course, which shows the long shadow that this dispute still casts over modern Mormonism. In fact, that Charted Course address still shapes BYU religious education. And so BYU is in this awkward place today where they're trying to be a world-leading academic research institution while the leadership is still trying to keep it in touch with those religious fundamentals. So In many of the departments on BYU campus, they have a world-class faculty, including on things like evolution and in science. But there's still always this concern over religious fidelity and instruction and fundamentals, especially with the recent backlash that has been documented by Peggy Fletcher Stack and the Salt Lake Tribune. I often tell people that BYU has the faculty of a Georgetown or a Notre Dame, but the administration more like a Liberty University. I hope this story emphasizes how cyclical these tensions are. And it should be a bit shocking to know that BYU religion faculty had more liberty in the 1930s or the 1920s than they'd have in the 2020s. And that just shows how history is never this predetermined march toward more acceptance and inclusion. If you want to learn more about this fascinating episode, the Chicago Experiment, I strongly recommend a book, Thomas Simpson's American Universities and the Birth of Modern Mormonism, 1867 to 1940, published by University of North Carolina Press, as well as an article by Casey Griffith titled The Chicago Experiment, Finding the Voice and Charting the Course of Religious Education in the Church. I hope you found this video interesting, hopefully even informative. If you did, please like the video and share it with others. History is only more relevant today than it's ever been because it helps us understand where we come from, the potential trajectories that led to this moment, and hopefully could frame discussions of where we can go from here.